We're going to record. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for those in Israel. Welcome to what is officially Parshat HaShavua discussion / shiur. But I think we'll talk a little bit about Purim and Megillat Esther. Although we had the opportunity Thursday night, a week and a half ago and a few days ago, to discuss a few halachic details that relate to Purim, I think it's appropriate to appreciate what the day is about. What is Purim about? And it's an interesting day, at least for me. I need my breakfast. For me, breakfast is very, very important. And you could function without a meal or two, but the quality of your functionality is, or your ability to function is diminished without food. Human nature. So it's always interesting to me that we enter into this day called Purim hungry. Now, those of you in Israel or in Yerushalayim are smiling right now, because in Yerushalayim you celebrate Purim on the 15th of Adar. So you have that 24-hour recovery from the 13th of Adar, the fast day, until Purim. But most of us, unfortunately, are not there. I hope to be there at some point in the land of Israel. But for the time being, I enter into Purim hungry. And I think a little bit about, it's interesting, there must be a message there, right? Here I'm entering into this very happy and significant day, whatever the significance and whatever the happiness is about. So David mentions Israelis don't celebrate this year because Israelis are actually reading the Megillah on the 14th this year, so they have to adjust. So that's correct, that those in Yerushalayim are going to have to adjust this year, and perhaps it's our chance because we're better adjusted to such a practice than they are. So we should have them in mind, right? But obviously they'll be 7 hours ahead. They'll get over it first. So what is this idea? And in general, when it comes to Purim, if you think about it, some people unfortunately have made it into Jewish Halloween, right? You get dressed, you party, the loyada. Obviously, we deep down believe that it must have a very significant message. And it goes in all directions. It used to be that Mishloach Manot was you sent food. Today, if you don't have a theme, don't you dare come to my house, right? In other words, you have to have a theme. How can you have Mishloach Manot where the Mishloach Manot do not match your costume? And my feeling is that 60 years ago, it wasn't like that. I don't know. I don't remember 60 years ago. Some of you perhaps do. So it's interesting what is the day about? That's really the question I'm asking. What is it about? Why are we entering into it with a fast day? I do want to mention that the fast day of Erev Purim, Ta'anit Esther, is more of a lenient fast day, meaning it's post-Talmudic. When it comes to all of their fast days, they are mentioned in the Talmud, and they even have reference to them in Tanakh. Right? When it comes to Tzom Gedalia, when it comes to Asara B'Tevet, Shiva Asar B'Tamuz, they have reference to them in the Tanakh, right? Ta'anit Esther is later, and it's important to remember that. Number one, it's more lenient. If a person is with a headache, a person is taking medications, any fast day that perhaps you would try and attempt to fast on another fast day, there is far more leniency when it comes to, it's far more leniency than a regular fast day. And it's interesting that a great commentator from the early 14th century labeled Ta'anit Esther, Ta'anit Shel Simcha. In other words, when we enter into other fast days, we're supposed to be mindful of the fact that it's a day to focus on self-improvement, focus perhaps on Jewish tragedies and learn from them and how we could do a better job in becoming a more unified nation. the focus on Ta'anit Esther still has to be simcha. So it's a very odd day when it comes to our feelings. And for me, obviously, we're trying to figure out what Purim is all about. Okay, that's the question. So my late father would tell us that there is actually, right, one verse in Megillat Esther that gives us a little bit of a picture regarding this holiday. And that is, when we start reading the Megillah, we have to realize that we are talking about a very challenging and tragic and difficult era for our ancestors. They were schwer Zeiten, difficult times. What do we mean by that? We Jews are able to deal with challenge. It's within our DNA that we overcome. I mean, look around, and we've all had the privilege and honor to interact with Holocaust survivors. And we've had the privilege and honor of seeing them come to Toronto, come throughout the Jewish world, not just achieving great things, but flourishing and building families. And obviously the bitterness never vanished. And anyone that, many of you who are children of survivors know very well that there was not a day that something within their day took them back to those difficult years. But nevertheless, we're around, they functioned, they went to the workplace, they built families, the most incredible generation. And I think that we have a schos, really, a merit of being in the same planet, right, and being in the same generation as survivors. Among the great challenges we went through was obviously the Babylonian exile, but then there was the disappointment. It appears that throughout our history, when we get a little bit of good news that better days are ahead, right? So we have that uplifting experience from the fact that good news is here, better things are waiting for us. Right afterwards, we go into a far worse situation again before it gets better. That's how it has worked throughout our history. If you look at our exodus, our departure from Egypt, Moshe Rabbeinu comes at the end of Parshat Shmot and tells them, guess what? Remember those key words that were handed down from the previous generation, pakod pakadati? Remember that you were told that if someone utters those words, it's a sign of the redemption. We're ready. And the nation was uplifted, right? Good news, we're going to be out of here. But right afterwards, what does Pharaoh do? He increases the workload and things get much worse. That's how it works. And when we were supposed to leave Babylonia, right, the end of the 70 years, Cyrus makes his declaration. Good news, we're returning to Israel, right? And Zerubbabel making his way throughout the Babylonian communities, telling them, guess what? We can go back to Israel. The vast majority of people were not interested. And the truth is, even those who did return, within a very short period, the permission that was granted for them to rebuild was withdrawn, a decline. And fast forwarding to the 20th century, I mean, you know the enthusiasm and the excitement that existed after the Balfour Declaration in 1920, after the San Remo Conference, where you grant the Jewish people a right to Eretz Yisrael, a lot of excitement. But afterwards, thanks to the Brits, with all due respect to our British friends here, but reality is that they made it difficult upon difficulty upon difficulty, and the gates of Eretz Yisrael were closed when they were needed more than any other time throughout history. I mean, think about it, the 1930s, late 1930s, 1940, there were people that were begging different countries to welcome them, not Canada, because one is too many, not the United States, and not Cuba, you know, the story of the St. Louis, not South America, perhaps Shanghai for a few lucky ones. Eretz Yisrael was closed. Thank you, British, very much. So we have that uplifting experience and then the down, the painful down. Megillat Esther is that down because it is a book, and the reign of Achashverosh is after they were granted permission to return from Cyrus, which predates the story. But during this period of time, there's no return to Eretz Yisrael. The allowance was taken, and the concept of a return from Babylonia was no longer a reality. Many Jews felt, you know what? Perhaps there's never going to be a return to the land of Israel. And they lost faith. And therefore, many have a tradition when they read about the big party. This is the book of parties, by the way. A lot of parties in Achashverosh. It appears the Persians are very good with their parties. I don't know. I mean, now since 1979, Persia is controlled by imams and Shiites who are very machmir with their parties. But historically, the Persians knew how to throw a good party. And the Shah, our good friend, the Shah, he threw some awesome parties. I remember watching once a documentary about his magnificent parties in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, Jimmy Carter being there and talking about an oasis here with the Persians. And as people had no running water, the Shah was spending millions upon millions flying in goods from Europe for his parties. The Persians knew about their parties. So as Achashverosh has his big party, the Megillah tells us that he brings out these impressive vessels, vekelim mikelim shonim. And the Talmud asks the question, wait a second, if you are telling me that he wanted to impress people with vessels, with utensils that are not found anywhere else, so it could have been kelim meshunim that look different. What does it mean, shonim? So the Talmud tells us that actually King Achashverosh presented at this feast vessels of the Bet HaMikdash, and he was making a statement. His statement was, listen here, I have an empire. This empire is a mosaic of many, many different cultures. You could feel comfortable with your culture as long as your culture does not expect independence from the empire. I am bringing the vessels of the temple because once upon a time, there was a temple in Jerusalem and there were some impressive utensils there. They are part of the Persian Empire today. You could see them, you could remember a little bit about your past, but don't you dare think about a future with those vessels playing a central role in your identity. It is the end of a return to your original nation. It might have sounded a little bit challenging to some, but it was extremely difficult for committed Jews, for the Mordechais that existed there, that deep down believe we were told by the prophets there's going to be a return. And this empire seems to indicate, you know what? You have your culture, your Jewish culture. You could bring it and make it part of a wonderful empire. Forget about Jewish independence. It's over. It's history. That was the party. And therefore, the Talmud notes that Jews who participated in that party willingly were part of that message, part of that agenda. Goodbye. Your connection to the land of Israel is finished. You are Persians. And there were no doubt, there were Hasidic Yidden there with payas in Persia singing the Persian anthem before ball games, right? God bless Persia, because they felt that we are part of this culture. This is our identity. And that was the tragedy. So the tragedies that we are dealing with here, number one, the fact and this belief that we're going to return after 70 years, the 70 years, according to almost everyone you would interview, most probably were gone. No return was taking place. That was a challenge. And in addition, you have to realize that this is a nation that had up until that point prophets to guide them, right? We talk about the Nevi'im. It's a fundamental part of our faith that God communicates with humanity through the words of a prophet. They have a vision, they have an understanding of the will of God, and they communicate. Prophecy is in this decline, significant decline. And there are far less prophets. And even the prophets understand that, we don't have the vision and the clarity of the past. This was a very difficult time for our ancestors. And we enter into the Purim story, right, with difficulty. And somehow, perhaps one explanation or something to think about as they are reading the Megillah. And sometimes people get agitated that they are banging too much with Haman, because every bang of Haman is another minute keeping me away from my coffee and my oatmeal, right? So it's not such an easy experience, the Megillas Esther at night. And perhaps there's a little bit of getting us in this mood. This was not an easy time for our ancestors. This was a challenging time, especially if you are one who believed. How do you defend tradition, right, that preached always a return after 70 years? The 70 years passed. Not an easy time for our ancestors. However, and here comes the verse that my father tells us, you know what, look at this verse and you'll have a little bit of an understanding of what's going on here. We introduce Mordechai. In the second chapter of the book, they introduce Mordechai. And there's a magnificent rabbinic tradition that if you look in Parashat Ki Tisa, and the Torah tells us that there are spices that are used to go ahead and anoint the vessels of the Bet HaMikdash, one of them is the Mardechaya, Marderor, and the translation in Aramaic is Mardechai. So what you need, the information you need to appreciate what the name signifies, it is a name that signifies a spice. Hadassah hi Esther. So here are the key words here. Another significant player in our story, or perhaps as we'll see soon, the most significant of all, is Esther, but she had a previous name. So to read from the Megillah, that Mordechai was Omen. Mordechai was the one to raise Hadassah. He Esther, she is Esther. So she was called Hadassah, but then they switched her name to Esther, a Persian name. And now the rabbis tell us that both names have significance. Name number one, Hadassah, which is a beautiful Jewish name. The Hadassah is the myrtle. Hadassah, the Hadassah, Hadass, provides an aroma, right? There are people that actually, for Motzei Shabbos, they make a bracha on a Hadass for their psamim. Some people at a Brit Milah make a bracha on the Hadass. You want to find something that symbolizes a smell, that's Hadassah. What's the significance? What's the significance here? So we have to remember, this is a period when the clarity of prophecy is in decline. And during an era of prophecy, it is not just clarity that a prophet would have. It seems to be that any Jew that was spiritually in tune understood, what he should be doing. It was a time of clarity. It's always interesting that people struggle with prayer at times, right? Here we have prayer. I'm supposed to have a conversation with God. Why is it that the rabbis gave me this precise formula that I say 3 times a day, and I'm given no flexibility when it comes to prayer? This is a question that is asked, and it's a good question. So obviously it appears that these words were established by people that were deeply in tune with the spiritual realm and chose the precise words that somehow work. So we have to plug ourselves into those words. So if I am davening for parnasa, if I am davening that my livelihood should be intact next year, so I'll have kavanah in barech aleinu. So I'm going to plug in my emotions and my thoughts into words that were put together 2,400 years ago by some incredible people. If I am davening for the health of someone, I'm going to plug my emotions and my thoughts into refainu. That's the way I do it today. But during an era of clarity, when we had prophets, and perhaps even the average Jew was in tune of the spiritual realm, it is very possible that words of prayer could be organic. They could be the words that I deeply feel. I could express my emotions with words that I come up. And that's why we don't find an established structure of prayer for the First Temple period, right? So it's an era of clarity. It's simply an era of clarity, but it's in decline. What we had as we enter into this story is what we'll call residual clarity. There was still an aroma. In other words, sometimes if you want to get you go to purchase a good coffee in town, and they grind your beans and it's fresh. You put it in your car, you bring it home. It's quite incredible that if they are good beans and they are fresh, you actually could still sense the aroma in the car, even if your beans have been already home for a couple hours, right? Aroma is an indication that there was something present there beforehand, and you have there, the residual aroma. Once upon a time when we had Kiddush in shul, right? That and if it was enhanced Kiddush, if you remember, remember the history of our shul, the enhanced Kiddush had cholent. So quite often after davening, people would come to discuss things with me. By the time I get into the hallway, so number one, there were people that were in a different type of mood. It's very interesting that I would interact with some people in the sanctuary during davening, and they appeared one way. By the time I get to the hallway, to the Fayar Kiddush, they were in a different type of mood. Must have been that they drank something that changed their mood. I don't know. It's on a round table. But also, I would sense that the chont would be gone, but the aroma of the chont was still there. Aroma, hadas, is a sign of something residual, something that remains from the past. And this is an era. The story of Megillat Esther is there's still a little bit of the clarity of the past. And you know who really lived by that clarity? Mordechai. Mordechai was a person that was in tune with the past, lived by the past. He was still a spice. He didn't just have the aroma of a spice. He still had the flavor. He had nevuah, he had prophecy, and therefore he functioned differently than Esther, as we'll see soon. But Hadassah adjusted and became Esther. And the rabbis tell us in the Talmud, the word Esther relates to Hester. When the presence of God is concealed, it's no longer obvious. You're no longer sensing it. You have to have the knowledge, right? You have to know that there's a creator. And the bright Jew studies science and studies natures and studies chemistry and studies biology and realizes that there's such wisdom in nature and realizes, Re'u mi bara ele, you recognize that there's a higher being here. But things are concealed. And the decision making is very, very different between one who believes that there are still signs from above and the one who believes that, things are concealed. You have to work with techniques. You have to go ahead and have a plan. You have to have strategy. If you don't have strategy, it's not going to work. So here we're going to see a difference between those, the Mordechai attitude, that there are signs from heaven, and you work with them because I'm from the era of clarity. And just as I could come up with my own words to connect to God, I see God and I see them as signs. And the Esther who says not so. You have to have strategy. It's a big problem when religion is not presenting a complete picture of behavior. What do I mean by that is, there are people you will interact with nowadays that will tell you that they made decisions based on a sign from above. I was planning to go ahead and to shop at No Frills, but as I walked out of my house, right, it was a windy day, and there was someone that had a recycling bin out, and the wind blew out from their recycling bin a flyer from Metro. And just as I was getting into my car to go to No Frills, a Metro flyer was flying by, right? And I said to myself, this must be a sign from heaven. God wants me to go to Metro. Now, if you would have grabbed the flyer and realized that they happen to have a good deal there, that would have been a ness, right? That Metro has a good deal. But if, let's say, you would have grabbed it and seen a good deal, that is not working with a sign. That's working with, your Jewish practice, that if you do see that they have magnificent grapes for $1.20, you're going to go ahead and purchase it. That's fine. But to see it as a sign from heaven, because I saw the Metro flyer flying, God wants me. So you think that everything you do, including your shopping, is guided by hashgacha pratis, by God is really guiding you where to shop. Perhaps that is true if you lived during the first temple period, where there was clarity. Perhaps that is true if you're a Mordechai, where Mordechai every minute of the day is focusing on his spiritual development, on prayer, on Torah, on Jewish continuity, and then he sees a sign, he'll work with it, and it's okay for Mordechai. You, unfortunately, or me, unfortunately, we have to work with the Hester Panim, right? And if I see that flyer flying, it teaches me that perhaps I should tell my neighbor to close his recycling bin even when it's windy. In other words, to do something practical. These are different approaches. And therefore, the story of the Megillat Esther is, number one, it's a book that's telling us, you know what? Even when there is a hand of God that's concealed, even when you don't see him, number one, realize that he's there. Realize that things that appear to be random, no, there is a God there. But you have the responsibility of planning. Strategy is something you should do. You know, there's, as many of you know, I struggle with the issue of living outside of Israel. This is something I've struggled with. And over the years, it grew, the struggle grew. Because the more I've thought through it, I realize Jews do belong in Eretz Yisrael, right? I deep down believe that it's the right thing to do. But when I woke up, I was already involved in an industry that they don't need in Israel. You have too many of them, right? There are too many rabbis in Israel. So if I would have known this earlier, when I was 19, perhaps I should have studied farming, right? Or the best way to get the most milk from a cow, or whatever it is, any field that they do need in the land of Israel, high tech, perhaps. And then I could have worked it out to make my way to Eretz Yisrael. So I struggle with this issue. But then comes the question, wait a second. If as a religious person, I believe that I belong there, I should just hop on the next plane. It's closed. Ben Gurion might be closed now, but God willing, in a couple of weeks, hop on the next plane and make my way to Eretz Yisrael. But the problem is, I'm not on that level to just pop in there without a plan. I need a plan. And I still have to, feed myself, a family, do good things there. So the issue is that we are in an era where we have to follow Esther. Now, even as I am planning, I'm still planning to pray, right? Even as I'm putting together in my mind different plans, I still have to turn to the Almighty to assist me. And that's what Esther is teaching us, that it is a Hester. Remember, there is a God, he's concealed, but work things out, have a strategy. Mordechai doesn't work like that, Esther does. And by the way, when we live our life with that understanding that we live within nature, right, and we make decisions as rational beings, and we do things, for example, if I feel that something is unsafe due to a pandemic, I'm going to go ahead and take care of myself, even though I want to go and do a mitzvah. The supernatural commandment of a mitzvah will not override the rational responsibility I have to my health, right? So even while I am living in this world of the concealed hand of God, I still realize and recognize and talk about God and recognize him and see events and look at my own personal history and the history of the Jewish people and say, you know what? The hand of God is there. He's unseen, right? The invisible hand is always there. And when a Jew lives in a rational way, with faith and with righteousness, you know what you are uprooting? You are uprooting the Amalek forces of the world. You know what Amalek, when we are told as Jews to uproot Amalek, it is much, much more. It is much, much more than uprooting a nation that we have no idea who they are today. It's uprooting an ideology, right? The ideology of Amalek is, you know what? The Jewish people, yeah, they had some success in the past. It's random. We have to uproot that which is random, an attitude that everything just occurs for no other reason. and there's no creator, and there's no destiny for the Jewish people, and there's no destiny for humanity. And if we live in a world, right, that takes these natural studies and believe that it's all the byproduct of natural selection and randomness, we could really cause destruction to the world. We fight it by saying, you know what, I'm going to be involved in the world, but still recognize there's a hand of God. And that's what Purim really is about, because we're going to read a scroll that doesn't mention the name of God, doesn't mention God at all. But behind the scenes, we know very well that, you know what, we are here, and the people of Israel are here. We're going to go through difficulty. We're going to go through challenges. We're still here. Welcome to the Purim story. So what I would like to do, now that we've had a little bit of an introduction, is to talk briefly about the strategy that Esther had. Because again, that's what she's here for, to teach us. And that's why it's the book of have strategy. Recognize there's a God. He's taking care of you, but please do your part. Do your part. And when it comes to the fact that she lands up as queen right before this awful decree, obviously there's a hand of God there. But her ability to figure out a way of hitting Haman, right, or uprooting his plan and uprooting the individual, that is where we study strategy. And, for example, when she obviously finally has access to the king, and with all due respect to Esther, she's not the only woman in Achashverosh's life. She might be the main queen, but Achashverosh has other, it's a king after all. And I don't know too much about Putin's personal life, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's more than one wife. Achashverosh clearly study the cultures of the past. A harem probably was in functioning very well there. Esther has access to the king, but she's nervous. She's very, very nervous. It's always fascinating to teach this to kids, that Esther was the wife of Achashverosh, and here she's trembling before she's going in, right? If the king does not go ahead and give the Shavita Zahav, Achad dato la'amit. And think about a 9-year-old processing this. Well, what kind of marriage is that? Answer is, it wasn't a normal marriage. Let's remember that. Yes, if there was an official party, there's no question that he would choose Esther over the other ones. She was the one that was presented publicly, took great pride in her, no question about that. But she was nervous. And she has finally access to the king, Vahi bayom hashlishi. And she turns to the king and she says to him, Imala melech tov, if it's okay, if you would come to a feast, mishteh, right? Mishteh asher asiti lo. Sounds good, but the problem is, what does she add? I would like to invite the king and the new prime minister Haman, ela mishteh asher asiti lo. King gets nervous, right? He's a jealous king, right? He already dealt with the queen that had her own agenda. And the wording she uses, asher asiti lo. Now, it could be understood that I made a feast for you, king. But it also, if he's a little bit paranoid, it could be that the king will understand that I'm inviting the king and Haman to a mishteh, to a feast, a banquet, asher asiti lo, for Haman. So she's getting the king a little bit nervous. And what's fascinating is that when they are at this banquet, and she makes the request for the second one, she changes it a little bit. Yavo hamelech v'aman el hamishteh asher eseh lahem. Here she for sure includes Haman. So it's not just paranoia. She's building paranoia within the man. And obviously, balayla ho nadedash natemech. The king simply cannot sleep. He's a nervous man. What is taking place here? Now, what does he fear more than anything else? Obviously, when you come to power through a coup d'etat, like Achashverosh, your concern is power will be taken from you the same way. And that was his great concern. So he does a little bit of research because he wonders, wait a second, what is my reputation when it comes to people who share information with me. Any totalitarian society works with snitches, right? People sharing information with government officials. The more you reward the snitch, number one, the more you corrupt the society because everyone's paranoid for one another, but it gives you the ability to stay in power, right? Like if you were in Iraq of the 1980s, you would never dare at any gathering say anything negative about Saddam Hussein because you know very well that there might be someone there that's going to go to a government official, share the information, get a reward, and the next day you're gone. And the same probably exists in North Korea. And this fellow now in Russia that's in the news, right? You know, you talk against Putin, you'll be in trouble, no question about it. So you're very careful with what you share with who, and it is all based on the reward system. So here Achashverosh is going to be researching how did I do in the past with people who shared information regarding my throne. And he does the research. And if you remember at the end of chapter 2, Mordechai did share information. He was not rewarded. And here, Achashverosh realizes, you know what? I have to do two things here. I have to start elevating the status of this Mordechai. And when people ask, why is Mordechai getting honored? Mordechai is getting honored because at the end of chapter 2, we read, he heard about a plot to assassinate the king. He shared the information through Esther. I reward those who open their mouth. And that's how Achashverosh felt I could deal with this uncertainty because clearly something is happening, right? The queen meeting Haman, obviously others are involved as well. But at the same time, he's developing a paranoia and hatred towards Haman. What's he planning? So therefore, the idea of Haman walking in and Mordechai saying to him, you know what? You go ahead, Haman, you're going to be the one to pull and lead Mordechai throughout the city, declaring this is the honor that we do to someone who the king likes. Two things are being accomplished here. And another important piece of information about Achashverosh, when it comes to politicians and their attitude towards Jews, and as we know very well, when you find a politician nowadays that has a harsh attitude, or any public figure that has a harsh and negative attitude towards Jews, towards Israel, deep down, a person who is anti-Israel is also anti-Semitic. And it could be proven. It could be proven, no question about it. So when it comes to politicians and their attitude towards Israel, in almost all cases, Israel, their attitude towards Israel is going to be number 2 on the list. Meaning, the politician, priority number 1, stay in power. Priority number 1. Number 2 is perhaps their attitude towards Israel. If either they hate Israel or they love Israel. It's number 2 on their list. And I don't want to say anything negative now about the new administration south of the border, right? But it's very interesting to me because as someone that has followed U.S. politics for many, many years, and I do remember, and it would be interesting to find it. I didn't put the time aside to find this, but in the early years of the George W. Bush administration, so this is talking about the year 2001, at some point between January 20th of 2001 and September 11th of 2001, there was a statement that came out of the White House regarding Israel. I don't remember the details, but had a little bit of a negativity, a little bit of a harshness. So a senator from Delaware got up and declared that the administration should be more supportive of Israel. Who was the senator? Joseph Biden. So Joe Biden was the pro-Israel voice, right? In 2001, harsh of the George W. Bush's administration. So I remembered it. I even mentioned it. I remember in Buffalo. Let's remember it. Let's, schus that Joe Biden has. On the other hand, I'm not saying anything negative now. I would not say anything negative, but if you had in the news, if you followed a little bit about him not calling Netanyahu, so it could be, he was busy with some other things, looking for, there could be a lot of different explanations as to why. But the feeling we get is it is not the same friendly person towards Israel of 20 years ago. What changed? The answer is when something is priority number 2, it will always be affected by priority number 1. Mr. Biden, President Biden, wants to stay in power. The forces that led him to the White House are not as friendly to the state of Israel. So therefore, there's going to be, I would never consider him anti-Israel, God forbid, but that strong voice is going to be a little bit minimized because of priority number 1 on the list. Stay in power, or to be sure to feed those who put you in power what they want. And Achashverosh is an anti-Semite. There's no question about it. The Gemara tells us that. He did not like Jews, but it was priority number 2. It was priority number 2. And therefore, what's going to take place now, and this turnaround that's taking place, where suddenly he's putting down Haman. And suddenly when Esther declares that Haman was the one that wanted to destroy the Jewish people. And Achashverosh's reaction, and Esther gets the credit, by the way, obviously the Almighty, but Esther worked it out that Haman should develop these harsh, negative, paranoid feelings towards Haman, that when there would be an opportunity suddenly to put Haman down, to kill him, he's going to jump. And this was his opportunity. When she gets up and says, you know what, king, there's someone that wants to destroy my nation. The Achashverosh says, Mi hu ze ve'eza, who on earth would want to kill the Jews? And when you think back and you say to yourself, wait a second, but Haman did it with tacit approval from Achashverosh. Well, remember how things work, right? That people in power, when they want something done, but they're afraid that it's going to come back and bite them, they don't say to do it. They perhaps hint, right? And how does the mafia work? That when the head of the mafia family wants someone dead, he doesn't say straight out kills Charlie Longhead. They don't say it, but rather what do they say? I don't want anything happening to Charlie on Sunday. So those around him understand very well that you got to kill him at some point between Monday and Friday. So kings and people in power know how to do things without saying them. And so to Achashverosh, he knew very well. Haman had hatred towards the Jews and had an agenda to uproot them. And as an anti-Semite, he had no problem. As long as it doesn't affect priority number 1 of his existence, power. Now suddenly, where he developed hatred towards Haman because Haman on the surface was after his power. Now suddenly, he has to take the Jewish cause and use it in the complete opposite direction. And the way he destroys Haman is by declaring Haman's a terrible person. He wants to get rid of the queen and get rid of the Jews. And I love Jews. And that was the whole agenda. The last part of the Megillah is all about Achashverosh becoming the greatest Jew lover, giving Mordechai the house of Haman, right? Wiping out a war against anti-Semitism. Now, he needed to do all that because otherwise, if he would have just killed Haman, and it was, after all, a country that did have a court system, and when the king would be asked, why did you kill Haman? He couldn't say, because I was paranoid that he might be taking my power. That wouldn't work. But now that his claim is that my goal is now to fight anti-Semitism. I'm going to fight anti-Semitism. This will be the end of this nasty, negative, terrible trait that humanity has to hate Jews. That's my new agenda. Suddenly, that justified him killing Haman. So it's an incredible turnaround that was the byproduct of Esther planting the seeds. The hatred towards Haman. Give Esther the credit, right? The paranoia that she assessed that he's a paranoid king, and that's how I'm going to get to him. Go ahead and give Esther the credit. And by the way, there is a turnaround that takes place. After we close this book of Esther, because afterwards there's King Darius, and the right to rebuild Yerushalayim is granted again. The return to the land of Israel is again strengthened. There is a turnaround that is taking place because of Esther functioning behester, when things are concealed. And this is what we have to be mindful of. A fast day is a time to think about self-improvement. That's really what it's all about. It's a time to reflect about what are we doing, right? What are we about? Tshuva. These are all elements of a fast day. What's fundamental for us Jews to understand is that what takes place to us as a nation is guided from above. And therefore, the greatest focus should be, we talk often about there's a problem of anti-Semitism throughout the world. No question about it. Anti-Semitism is a problem. So we have organizations that are doing good things. In no way do I want to minimize what incredible organizations are doing. And you have Hasbara that is working very hard on college campuses, a very, very harsh environment, a toxic environment, what exists in college campuses. Baruch Hashem, it's a little bit better than it was a decade ago, but it's still terrible, right? So you have to give credit to these organizations. And every single time that there's graffiti on a shul, obviously organizations have to do their part to fight it. As Torah Jews, we believe that part of it should be us becoming better. And it is actually a way of fighting anti-Semitism. In other words, if my concern is Jewish unity, and I want, even though I have a different outlook than other Jews, to get along with them, and I want to be sensitive when I talk about other Jews, and I believe that going ahead and putting effort into shalom is a Jewish priority. And if that's what I think about during a fast day, that's a good fast day. And I'm supposed to enter Purim. If Purim is all about the fact that, listen, God is hester, God is concealed, but he's still there. So the way I prepare for that day is, what? I am a Jew that believes in planning. I'm a Jew that believes that we're supposed to have a good army and good intelligence, and God bless the Mossad, and continue wreaking havoc in Syria. Do your part, but do it with an understanding that there's a higher being. There's an image that I would argue that every person here today is inspired by. And that is when you see a chayal, an Israeli soldier, and some of them are really kids, right? The older you get, the more you look at them as kids. When you see a chayal by the kotel with a kippah and praying, it becomes an image of, what? This is the Israel I want. I want an Israel that functions in hester, that functions that, yes, God is not, it's not obvious at times that he exists. God conceals himself. And as a result, I want a state that plans well, right? I want them to have intelligence, and I want them to have soldiers that have the holy mission of defending the Jewish state. Magnificent, right? There are stories of Holocaust survivors who would get emotion in the early days of the Jewish state when they would see a Jewish soldier with a gun, because they said, for us, a gun always meant, for us in Europe, what was a gun? Here's a person that's out to get us. If they were Polish, if they were Ukrainian, or if they were Germans. To see someone holding a gun that's just saying, I'm here to defend you, that's incredible. That's what we want. But we want them by the kotel. We want them davening. We want them to realize, yes, we're doing our part. And yes, we have strategy like Esther, but we realize there's a higher being. And to enter into an Esther, the day of strategy, the day of planning, the day of working things out, and being very, very proud of what we do, right? There's no one that enjoys a good Mossad story like I do, right? I really, really love them. And when I talked about how they got rid of this a Nazi from Riga, and they got rid of him in Montevideo, and I talked about it, a few years ago or some time ago, I really, really enjoyed it. Why did I enjoy it? Because these are my people doing our part in keeping the Jewish people intact and showing that there's such a thing called Jewish pride. I'm very happy, but I need a day of meditation, of prayer, as I enter into this state of strategy. That's my Tanit Esther. I think that, with all the planning, I must realize and recognize that there's a higher being. Bring the two together. You create a very impressive Jew. And that's the happiness. The happiness of Purim is that we live our life in a world where God is concealed, but he's still with us. And we bring him into our life with happiness. When an attitude towards Judaism is that Gewalt, it's a pain, and oivei, how much difficulty it creates. It's very hard to transmit it to our children, to the next generation. It's also hard for us to swallow. When we feel, this is a privilege, that I do what's right in the natural world, but I recognize that there's a higher being at the same time. Welcome to a healthy Judaism. That's what Esther, that's what Purim is about. And that's how we're supposed to look at this magnificent period of time. Obviously, as we have this challenging Purim that's very, very different than any other Purim, where we're not going to be getting together the way we usually do, we could still feel that connection to one another. Hopefully, we could still be, in contact through the technology that God Almighty was kind enough to provide for us. Imagine a pandemic 20 years ago before Zoom. I think it would have been even worse. And hopefully, we could utilize. Tradition teaches it's a time for prayer, and Purim, may the Almighty hear the prayer that good news continue flowing in our direction. May the Almighty allow this magnificent country called Canada, this gigantic country called Canada, to be inspired by a very small country called Israel. I remember when I had the schus 7 years ago to go on the trip to Israel with the prime minister, with former prime minister Harper, the one that did not have very nice hair, but had other qualities, if you remember him. So we had that evening, that incredible evening at where Prime Minister Netanyahu came, and all the big shots of the Jewish state came. It was a very impressive one. One of the memories I have is that they were bombarding us beforehand with information that you have to realize that although the gathering and the dinner and the banquet is going to be in the hotel itself in the bottom floor, there's going to be security. There's going to be a tremendous amount of security to make your way down the stairs, and therefore come 90 minutes early, meaning there was an 8 o'clock event, but they told us to already start planning to get down the stairs at 6:30. So I took these things very, very seriously. So at 6:31, I go down the stairs and I'm expecting long lines. I was the first one there. I went through, yes, there was security. It took me about 20 seconds. So by 6:32, I'm already in the room, right? And no one there. And obviously, people started rolling in. It was an opportunity to meet a whole slew of interesting people at the time. So as the dinner is taking place, Netanyahu, turns to Harper and says, what, our countries are similar, right? The size of Canada, the size of Israel, and everyone started laughing because we all know that to travel coast to coast in Canada takes you a week. When in Israel, you could do it if you drive in as an Israeli in an hour, right? So a very different world. Ha ha ha, small Israel and big Canada. And look where we are with vaccines, right? Look. So it's an interesting time. And obviously the Torah Jew has to realize, this is not random. This is not random. There's a message there. There's a message of the kindness of the Almighty, that he could take a new nation that's built by Holocaust survivors, and look what it's achieving. There's something we should feel. And we should feel gratitude that, yes, there's Esther, but we're achieving great things. And let's put our strategy to work, but do it for the sake of heaven, to have the positive impact that we're supposed to have. That's it.